Hey, what's up, guys? It's your boy Days, and you're about to watch Thorin rant for about 3 hours.
This topic is a story about a North American lineup in Counter-Strike 1.6 that came together without much fanfare, without much expectations they'd accomplish anything great, and they managed to close, with some consistency, the gap between the top of the North American scene and the top of the European scene. And that was very significant, but to explain why, I'm going to have to explain some of the history of North American Counter-Strike. But within there's some lessons, some elements to think about, food for thought for modern day North American lineups, which sometimes have very skilled players, but oftentimes lag behind the absolute best European teams. So in CS history, there was always a gap between the elite European teams and the best North American teams. Now, generally North America, they could pretty much always produce at least one team capable of competing, sometimes beating the top European teams. Even when we say European, we mainly initially mean Swedish. Sweden literally at times could produce teams where, for example, at CPL Summer 2003, 3 Swedish teams were the top 1, 2 and 3 of the tournament. Now, as well as Sweden, Norway, which admittedly always had organisational problems, had the talent with Element and Dark and Knoxville and Nikon and Damien and Executor and all those guys. They had the talent to do it as well. They just often didn't have the lineups. In reality, if you look at the best North American teams, they were typically at a similar level to the top UK team, Four Kings, German team, Mouse Sports, French team, so early on Against All Authority, later on Good Game, depending on what way around you want to do that one. Danish teams oftentimes weren't the absolute best. They were often one step below like the best North American teams. But you even look at the nature of those North American teams, and it's kind of obvious as to why they're all lacking something to make them the best team, to make them a team better than the top Swedish teams. So if you have the skill-stacked lineups, of which there were many, X3 and 3D being the most obvious examples, so K-Sharp, Rambo, Moto, these sorts of guys, the problem they had was they stacked a lot of skill, they played very individually to their skill, they didn't have great practice. They had some decent team playing as much as they liked each other, they were very good players, but they didn't have very good coordination, they didn't have very good prac, they used to just go in the server and just own everyone, and as a result they didn't have proper strats ironed down. They didn't have a great in-game leader. They famously let Moto go and he went off to TSO, which is then when we get another top team that could compete with Europeans. We had the TSO, the Speakeasy, where Moto went over, he took his old mate Kane from DOP, and then he got a bunch of the players that were already in TSO, and they'd been like a good team, but not a great team. Here was an example of a team that at last had the tactical element, had some decent team play, had no real egos in the way that helped with some of those factors, had a good role balance, who practiced properly. What was their problem in the end? They lacked the star player killer instinct. So they chalked away their chance at CPL Summer 2002 to get a top 2 or 3 finish, and instead came 5th when minimum they should have been 4th. They could easily have come 2nd or 3rd with how that game was going against SK in the upper bracket on Train. Sadly, didn't happen for them, because that's one of the things about star players, very skilled players, is they tend to have that confidence that comes from having that ability. This team didn't have it, and so in the crucial moment, they fell apart. Then you look at the United 5 team of Hare and Moses and Frod in his early iteration. They didn't have the experience. They just got to the top very, very quickly by having good tactics and some good players and like a bit of everything, but they weren't the best at any area. They didn't have the best players, and therefore the best they could do was the 7th place. Then you look at the Gamercore/Rival lineups. Now, they had the skill. They actually had a lot of skill. They had a scrimmy style, which could throw Europeans off. They had a lot of confidence because they used to just permanently play on LAN in SoCal area. But they didn't have much else. Their team play was a bit iffy. They played together for a while. That helped. They didn't particularly have tactics or nothing particularly revolutionary. Then along came Complexity. And Complexity were the game changers. They were the outliers. They were the real team to break through and have most of the components in place. And what you've got to do is look at the formation of this team, and you'll get a sense for why that was. So initially, Complexity appeared on the scene when they were just a CAL, I think, open team initially. Jason Lake used to play on the team as coL. One of the things he initially did, because he had money compared to normal players, was he hired Knoxville from NOA to play online with a 100+ ping, even though Knoxville wasn't that skilled a player, but because it was like Cal Open or Cal Main, it was easy enough for them to still win some games. That got them some attention. Then he was able to get in some of the players who kind of been washed up from the LAN scene, like Warden, etc. Famously, he eventually, after making some real sort of noise in the scene, bragging about what he'd do. He was able to secure Bullseye, who'd been one of the best veteran pros. He hadn't been an extremely skilled player, but he was a good all-around player, good clutch player, famously from Team 3D and X3. He'd won majors with those guys, well, with Team 3D at least. And he was able to get this guy to join rather than retire, because initially he retired from Team 3D. So he had one big piece there, he could attract other pieces. Now this is a story of 3 teams which helped to later form Complexity. So there's a team called Forsaken at the end of 2003. There was a team called TSG, who was around in 2004 in the summer. And there was the U5 team from late 2003 coming into 2004. So Warden and Storm, later Complexity members, were together on Forsaken. Warden helped pick a Stored up from Cal, I think it was IM at the time, where he was considered cheater. Storm and Sunman were then on TSG the next year. United 5 already had Fraud and Trip, but then United 5, after the summer of 2004, decided to make a team that would all be based at a team house in Chicago. And so as a result, they took from TSG, Sunman, CBZ, Dominator, and that left Complexity with the leftovers, because some of the players got kicked out of U5 who didn't want to move there. And so as a result, Complexity took in all the leftovers. They took in Fraud and Trip from U5. They took in Storm and Warden. Storm, formerly from TSG, Warden had just been chilling, and Bullseye was already in the team. Later on, they would get Sunman instead of Bullseye, because he really did want to retire, and someone was a pretty good player. Also, previously had been in TSG, was actually in the U5 team, but the one that failed, unfortunately, at the big CPL. They immediately had a top finish. They finished 5th place, beat some European teams. Next year, they went to CPL Barcelona. This is when they had Sunman now. They finished 2nd, only losing to Mouse Sports. At ESWC, they managed to win the event, a major in Europe, despite all the top teams being there generally. Obviously, the Swedish scene was in a bit of disarray. There was no SK Gaming there. They just had the split with NIP, and they went to CPL Summer instead. But aside from that, they beat the top teams. They beat the best Danish team. They finished ahead of the best German team, ahead of the best Korean team, then again the Chinese team, all top team, Brazilian team. The interesting thing though is, as you can tell by that story, these aren't players who necessarily chose to be in this team. These are players who were rejected elsewhere, who were misfits in that sense, who weren't the top names to recruit. As a result, when they got their chance on Complexity, they were hungrier. They bonded together over the fact that they were misfits and outcasts. They were less likely at the first chance to hop to another team, because those teams had rejected them. They had finally had kind of something going on within this squad. Then you also had some players here who were very, very skilled. Fraud was still one of the best NA players. He hadn't quite gone supernova like he did later when Complexity got going. Storm had shown some promise when he'd been in TSG, but still hadn't done that much overall. Bullseye was obviously a legend, but was on his way out. So they had a nice little mix of players. Crucially, they practiced properly. They had real practice hours, and they used to go over strategies, and they used to look at the demos. They had motivation. They wanted to go undefeated in these online seasons, which they were able to do early on, something that no one had done in NA history since like 4 or 5 years earlier at the very beginning of the game. They were able to go undefeated, I think 2 Cal invite seasons, the top level of online player. They had leadership from Jason Lake at the top, inspiring them to want to compete and really like forcing them to get their heads in the game. They had Warden, who was able to help with some of the practice aspects and keeping people even keeled. They then went, and what did they do? Something no NA team had done to that point in time. They not only won a major, Team 3D had done that, they won a major in Europe, in the heartland of the best teams Counter-Strike had ever produced, at ESWC. In theory, one of the hard majors to win. This was a tournament that finally introduced single limb bracket instead of the massive double limb brackets. And they were able to beat out the best teams generally in the world at the time. Remember, Mouse Sports was considered the #1 team in the world when they went that tournament. They'd beaten Complexity in the CPL Barcelona final. Complexity won this major. They went on. Sure, they might have lacked a little bit of skill compared to some of the European teams, but they had Fraud, who was absurdly good, arguably the best player in the world that year, 2005. They generally had enough skill to activate all that nice team play, to get those good tactics going, to get that, on the one hand, a good mindset, but not an overly cocky mindset like the Team 3Ds of the world had, where they just skill stacked and they never generally accomplished what they could have done with that talent level. So it wasn't a lesson a lot of NA teams took from this. They just thought, Fraud is sick, haha, and so is Storm. Like, they never got what the deal was with Complexity. And even in CSGO, I've seen many of the same complaints, excuses given by NA teams who haven't followed this approach. Where's the NA team that practices and had the mindset of an Astralis? Where is the NA team that's invested in its infrastructure like North and Astralis have? Where are any of these squads, right? There's plenty of top European teams, FaZe Clan, for example, who don't have great practice traits and haven't really done things all the right way, but they got away with it because they had the mad skill, right? This is one of the aspects where you've got to know history to know how things were done in the past. Otherwise, you're trying to invent the wheel now. The wheel's invented over 10 years ago, 15 years ago at this point in time, boys. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, James Harding, NateDOhDoubleG, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, Travis Greb, Tristan Jones, Daniel Olivar, Jiangheng Lu, and special thanks, as always, goes out to Jerky's Minion, one of my OGs. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question. I have a monthly AMA. Perhaps you want teasers for who the next guests are on my upcoming talk shows. Maybe you want to be part of my monthly discussion where my top patrons talk to me. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the description box link for Patreon.